The presentation, which we're about to share with you, a conversation between myself and Dr. Anthony Saroyan, is part of a series of talks that we've been hosting here at St. John Armenian Church, all centered around the common theme of healing. This year at St. John, 2024, we are experiencing a year of healing. On the third Sunday of every month, we are offering a special prayer service at the conclusion of the Divine Liturgy and inviting members of the community who are in need of it to come forward and to join us praying to our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ for healing in all areas of their life, mind, body, and soul. The first presentation back in January that launched this series was about the healing prayers of St. Gregory of Narek. The following month, we invited Diran Avakian to speak to us about healing grief in our lives. Last month, in March, we welcomed Anahid Telfeyan, who spoke to us about the importance of healing through confession. And tonight, we're going to explore the topic of intergenerational trauma. And to help guide us through this conversation, we are going to be joined by Dr. Anthony Saroyan, who is no stranger to the Armenian-American community of the Bay Area. Having completed his doctorate at the University of San Francisco, he spent several years with us here before pursuing his career, being a part of all of the institutions of this community. And we were sad to see him go when he left to pursue, I guess, his aspirations as a psychologist. However, I consider him to be our resident mental health consultant here at St. John Armenian Church. Deacon Anthony and I, many years ago, collaborated on an episode of the St. John podcast entitled Let's Talk About Mental Health, which was one of our most popular podcast episodes. And for many people, I think was like a really important stepping stone for them to have a better understanding of things like depression and anxiety, and to understand how they can receive help for those things in their life, both through their spirituality as well as by accessing mental health services. I'd like to welcome Dr. Anthony Saroyan to this evening's live stream. It's great to have you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, as another side note for our participants this evening, as I mentioned to Dr. Saroyan before we proceeded with this evening's live stream, this whole thing is put together with bubblegum and duct tape, and we're hoping at some point it doesn't fall apart over the next hour as we are sharing with you this presentation.
Absolutely.
I'm getting a note here that, that's okay, we're good. We're live on YouTube. Wonderful.
Yes, good.
So yeah, if there are comments or questions, feel free to jump in on the live stream. So we hope that this all continues to work until the end of today's presentation. I'm also happy to be joined in the sanctuary by my 5-year-old son, Sion, who is with us because I had forgot that I was scheduled to babysit him this evening while his mother and his sister went to see the ballet. So he is occupying himself here in the sanctuary, but I would not be surprised if he serves to be a source of an interesting experience this evening during the live stream.
Or wisdom.
At some point. Or wisdom, always a source for me anyway, for growth in my own journey towards wisdom. So before we dive into the topic, Anthony, why don't you share with me some information about what you've been up to the past several years since you were with us here in the Bay Area?
Yeah, I think it was last podcast was 8 years ago, I think. It's hard to believe it's been that long. So when I did the podcast, I was a student still, but working at Juvenile Hall over in Martinez in the Bay Area, in the East Bay. Then I left for my pre-doctoral internship at a prison, Chowchilla, a men's prison over there, state prison. Then I left, when that completed, I then worked in Corcoran at a state prison over there for 5 years. Then just about 6 months ago, I decided to leave the CDC, California Department of Corrections, for a good opportunity provided me at the federal prison. So now I'm at a federal prison in in the Central Valley, which is a high-level penitentiary over there. So I've kind of gotten the whole gambit of all the correctional. I've done parole before that even. So it's been quite the journey. I never knew this was my path that I was going to take when I first started, but it's been an enjoyable experience so far for me. And we'll see what the next step after this might be.
Yeah, we're praying for your success, and we're thanking God for the opportunity that you have to touch people's lives. I know that your doctoral thesis had particularly to do with the access that men have to mental health care services.
Yeah.
I'm sure that that has translated well into working in correctional facilities. And I'm sure that you've had some further insight into the topic that we're discussing today, intergenerational trauma, working with inmates in penitentiaries.
Absolutely. Especially that's good you brought that up, actually, because a lot of them come from different backgrounds, of course, different upbringings, different opportunities, experiences, and you can really pinpoint a lot of situations I deal with to their, to their generational kind of lineage, in the sense of situations they had to go through with, of how do I explain it in a clearer sense? Every culture has something that's happened to them, I would say, in that sense, right? And the way that it's passed down, which we're going to talk about in a minute, can impact the future generations for good or bad. It doesn't always have to be a bad thing also, right? So transgenerational passing down of things could be trauma, or it could also be kind of a resilience aspect for them as well, if that makes sense. Yeah,
it does make sense.
And it's also men I work with. So
it does make sense because, well, the reason that we chose the topic for this month to be transgenerational trauma is because this is of course genocide commemoration month. We observed April 24th just a week ago, and for some time now, this generation of young Armenian Americans have been pursuing this question of, what have we inherited? Both, what can we celebrate and give thanks to God for in terms of the legacy of resilience, of striving for a brighter future, of faith that has been the bedrock and foundation of our lives, and restoring it to the fullness of its glory in the life of our communities throughout the diaspora and the homeland, while at the same time still taking an accounting of how we are living in the aftermath of the genocide and how it continues to affect us until today. At a recent open forum discussion at my parish, somebody asked me a question as to why the Armenian Church doesn't have more active monasteries. And this is just one of many questions about the reality of the Armenian Church today, that we have to look to the Armenian genocide to find the root of the reality of the situation. Well, we don't have as many active monasteries as we used to because so many of them were destroyed, along with so many of our clergy as well. So in the midst of both this opportunity for us to celebrate the wonderful things that we have inherited from our forebears, it is also this time to take a stock and an accounting of, what else have we inherited along with that. So on that note, can you just give us a better idea of what it is we are talking about when we're talking about intergenerational trauma?
Yeah, it's intergenerational trauma is more so has to do with our manners, our behaviors, our view of others, just the way we navigate the world. And if we pinpoint it back to previous generations before us and the experiences they had. So I'll give you an example, which we'll talk about more later, I'm sure. But in 2020, the attacks on Artsakh that happened in October of 2020, I think I can speak for most Armenians that it just hit us. It just hit us in a different way than we would have even imagined, of the trauma kind of being brought up in our system, right? A lot of people I talked to at that time, and currently still, it reminded us of what our ancestors went through, and that kind of guilt, as if we always say, what would we have done if we lived in 1915? What could we have done to help the process? So a lot of people, our generation at this time, had that guilt of, we have to do something. We have to do everything possible within us to assist our brothers and sisters in Artsakh, because we don't want to let them down, because we don't want to relive another genocide and disappoint our ancestors. So that kind of guilt we had. A lot of people have guilt, which is, again, I would say, as much as it's trauma for us, it's also a strength of us. I think trauma can also bring strength at certain times. Our unity, especially during that time, because our Armenian community, unity, it ebbs and flows just like any community at times, right? But when there's a shared trauma event, especially like that was happening and currently still happening, I don't want to ignore that part too. Uh, Everyone, regardless of your political views, this and that, everyone really bonded together for his strength at that moment. And then, of course, it kind of went away and it's kind of going back and forth, right? But that is a prime example of a strength that came from a trauma, a generational trauma we have, is our reaction as a community. Does that make sense? Yeah.
That does
So I think
make
that's a pretty
sense.
relatable experience for most people. I think that because people that are not even that involved in the Armenian community were lack of a better word, triggered by that event, right? It kind of activated a part within us. I never thought I had. I've always been proud to be Armenian. I've always been involved in the community. I never thought I had that kind of emotion in me. Whatever that emotion was, it was anger, fear, sadness, guilt. I had a
Hmm.
lot of guilt, and the guilt a lot of us had in the diaspora was a kind of guilt that there's really limited what we can do in that time. But if there's a 1 ounce of opportunity to help Armenia and Artsakh, we all felt the need, internal need. It wasn't even like a pressure. It was an internal obligation to respond. And I remember during that time, I would read my great grandfather's memoirs of his experience in the genocide, and I really would get emotional after like 1 page of reading that. It was pretty hard because not that I felt it like he felt it, but I felt what he was saying more. I could kind of process what he was saying more because we've all heard the stories of our ancestors, but during that time, I think a lot of people really understood it from a different angle because it was kind of it was a current event going on that really kind of reflected on that for us. So just that emotional response that myself and many of us had is a prime example of transgenerational trauma. Another example could be uh, when it comes to mental health. I hope I'm not jumping around too much. It's that thing of when that guilt we might have for having issues in our life, right? Everyone has issues. Our ancestors had issues. Our grandparents, our parents, our kids, they all have issues, right? Everyone's just being a human, right? Or experiences we go through. Well, a lot of people look back on, let's say, their grandparents or great grandparents that were survivors of the genocide that we see as very stoic and very reserved, and you know they were successful after the genocide, and they made a name for themselves in America, and they were successful, and so on and so on. So we look back on that, and we say, well, look at me, I'm sad, I have depression, I have anxiety, I have these issues going on. Why should I feel this way if they survived a genocide and they moved to a new country and speak the language and still were able to be successful? Why am I having this and they didn't have that? But the reality is that, believe it or not, could be a part of transgenerational trauma also, in the sense that a coping mechanism our ancestors may have had, which was effective at the time for them, was to repress their experiences and not pass it down on the kids. So if they experienced a lot of traumatic events during the genocide, which many did, then to protect their kids, they might not have talked about what they went through. And as a result, that can get passed down as if it bubbles out one way or another, right? What you resist persists is a famous quote by Carl Jung. So what happens is they may be very stern with their kids, or like they're angry. Let me back it up a little bit. Their experiences of repressing what they experienced in the genocide, which again was a way for them to survive and to get through life in a sense, might have been passed down as a lack of communication with their own kids, right? And then their kids might not have had good communication with their parents and had that kind of disconnect from them, let's say, or yeah, help jump in anytime you can. You understand what I'm saying in that sense? So, like the way you communicate could be a result of holding back emotions as well, right? To protect your
Yeah,
kids, when you protect your kids, you might
right.
not actually truly be protecting them by holding back emotions because they don't see what you're really going through in that sense.
So, jumping back to what you were saying before, I hadn't
Yeah,
connected the experience, the common experience that we all had of going through both the 2020 war and then recently the
yeah,
devastating events of last fall that resulted in the unjust forced exodus, ethnic cleansing of our brothers and
yeah,
sisters from their ancestral homeland in Artsakh. In terms of the response that we had, being informed by the trauma or through the lens of the guilt that we carried, not the guilt,
yeah,
but I guess a sense of responsibility. I think we all felt like, we were watching events unfold and asking ourselves,
Yeah.
we know where this is going. How can we help prevent, what our ancestors had to go through? And there's a deep sense of personal responsibility and absolutely guilt and shame associated with not being able to do more.
Almost like a survivor's guilt in the concept.
Yeah, very much so. I think survivor's guilt is a good way to put it. It was a desperate need on the part of many to try and contribute something meaningful. Yes, I think that's God-pleasing, and thank God many people felt that sense of responsibility. But I could see how it did come for many, perhaps from this place of, I know what my grandparents went through. I know, what my great-grandparents went through. I know what the history of my people is. And shame on me if I'm not able to be, in some way a part of helping to resolve or alleviate this issue. And I saw that escalate to an unhealthy degree. I think I saw people feeling, I think the right word is shame for not being able to do more, or a sense of like embarrassment because other people could do more and they couldn't.
Yeah.
Which was unfortunate. It did cause a great deal of suffering during a time of generally great suffering. And I know myself, I felt the same way at times. And there was, after the events took place, a real, what many people have, expressed is to be legitimate grieving, and to the degree that it was a depression for some that lasted a significant period of time. So yeah, I think there's a lot to unpack there. But coming to what you were saying before about communication, coping mechanisms, this idea that our ancestors were hesitant for many reasons, perhaps, to speak openly about their experiences with their children and grandchildren. The fact that they were not able to, express their pain and their grief in a healthy way often, and so therefore they were not able to give those skills to their children. Is that something that can happen from generation to generation? I mean, because my great-grandparents are genocide survivors. Is it the case that, so they were unable to teach healthy coping mechanisms to their children, and then on and then on? Is that what we're talking about?
Absolutely. But that's also, to be clear for people listening, it's case by case also. Obviously, not everyone that went through the genocide also would have unhealthy coping skills or communication skills with generations also. So it depends on the situation, right? And it's neither good nor bad, right? How people responded to it, right? It's just the way we survive in life. But absolutely, in the sense of you can look back and say, oh, maybe not you or me in that sense, but for someone, they might have a situation where it's my great uncle, my grandma, my grandpa, my great grandpa was a very cold man. He never talked to his kids. He didn't ever want to bond with us, this and that. And that could have also been, for example, a fear of getting too close to someone because then you might lose them, right? Or vice versa, getting close and then you're gone, and now you've devastated them with your absence, right? And that, again, is just kind of the thoughts that someone during a genocide, I would imagine, would have, right? Not that we've been through it, but I can imagine it's that kind of way of wanting to protect someone from getting close to you because you or them may be lost, and it's to protect your own kind of emotions or soul in that sense, I would say, right? And theirs as well, right? So that could be one way. Another one could be someone could be so devastated, truly, by what they've been through that it might lead them to kind of be numb inside or have anhedonia, which is loss of pleasure, right? Kind of loss of ability to connect with someone, or severe depression, right? And their inability to connect with someone as a result. But then that child grows up believing they didn't love me, they didn't care for me, this and that. But that is not the case. It's just their own experiences kind of just numbed so much their own emotion to connect to someone that it leads to that experience for the offspring. But the offspring then might pass down, okay, this is how it means to be a parent, it is to be cold and this and that, right? So it's that kind of unspoken communication that gets passed down and without kind of meaning behind it. When there's no meaning behind it, children just assume that's what it means to be a parent, that's what it means to be a kid, so on and so on. So that's kind of It has to do more with the unspoken, I would say, communication from what I've seen in that sense. Just the way,
Right.
if you grow up in a area that, let's say, for policing, right? If it's the police, let's say, might target a community, right? Parents might learn to be more aggressive with their own kids, because if I'm more aggressive with my own kids, that will protect them from being shot by law enforcement, whatever it is. I've heard that from other communities I work with, for example, right? Uh, that's one example. Another one could be uh, my kid. I don't want him to join a gang, let's say, right? So I'm going to be very hard on my kid, be very strict on him, and this and that to protect him from the alternative situation, right? Joining a situation like that, right? That, in my opinion, is a prime example also of generational trauma for different communities. Not so much ours in these examples I'm giving, but this is what I deal with in the prison system when I work with those individuals, right? So generational trauma has very different ways of going about. To tie kind of to my dissertation topic of mental health for Armenian men, right? This has to do kind of from a general level, though, is our last names are very important as an Armenian, right? Because that, you don't ask them what's your first name, you say what's your last name when you meet an Armenian, right? If I meet a Hago, the first thing I follow up is what's your last name, because I want to know if I can connect it to their family. You know, you understand what I'm saying with that?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so example, if there's a Saroyan, let's say, that uh, might have done something bad or may have mental health issues or so on, right? And let's say I don't have this background in psychology and all that stuff. The family might want to shield that individual from the community because they don't want to have that reputation as, oh, the Saroyans are now depressed. The Saroyans are psychotic. The Saroyans are so on, so on. So that kind of aspect of our family kind of shielding, them individuals from the community also, I would argue, is also a form of transgenerational trauma in that sense of kind of the reputation, family reputation in that sense. And that's huge in our community because one
Yeah.
bad apple makes them all spoil in that sense. It's kind of how it's viewed in a
You
sense.
do have the advantage of quite the opposite of that, having received the last name from a national hero.
Yeah.
But maybe not all of us are so fortunate as you. I understand what you're saying.
Yeah.
Of course, I'm referring to William Saroyan. I'm sure everybody watching knows who that is, and if you don't, please look him up. You know, but
There's actually a
one
cool
thing that
article.
comes to my mind. Go ahead.
Oh, just I was interviewed about 2 years ago by the Armenian Weekly on William Saroyan. I tell people he's a relative, but I don't have too many stories about him just because he passed 10 years before I was born. My grandpa also passed 10 years before I was born. So the article was pretty cool because I was able to make it about my grandfather's story, which is pretty connected to the community as well. And yeah, it talks about the whole journey of the genocide and how the intersection between our family and Williams. That's a pretty cool article.
All right, that's awesome. I'll check that out. Well, what I was thinking about, first of all, you're completely right. We can't generalize and say, you know, every descendant of a genocide survivor is necessarily, you know, equally affected by intergenerational drama or trauma. We're Armenians, so drama is a necessity, but trauma is something else. But unfortunately, you know, that isn't the only source of trauma in our nation's history. I mean, you know, there are many other places from which we can be, unfortunately, the inheritors of probably traumatic, you know,
the earthquake even
effects.
I mean, that's a big one.
You know, the impact of Soviet persecution, the earthquake, the pogroms in Azerbaijan. Of course, here, as you know, in San Francisco, we have so many refugees who come from Baku and, you know, were exiled during the pogroms in Sumgait and, you know, trace their roots back to Artsakh, the war in Artsakh, you know, the subsequent wars and other events which have taken place that affect them. So all of these things, you know, are potential areas where we can intersect in our lives in such a way that, you know, oh, maybe this is touching on our reality right now in a way that we don't realize. So while it's possible to extrapolate based on some of the examples that you gave us of, you know, maybe what does it look like to be somebody who is experiencing transgenerational trauma, how could a person, if I wanted to know, right, Is
Yeah.
this something that is a factor in my mental health and my outlook, etc.? What would be the process of trying to cultivate that awareness, and what would be the value of it?
This is my own personal view. It's not really backed up with evidence in that sense, but this is my personal view. I tell people is to ask about your family story. Ask about your as a family, not like a if you're with your family, ask the elder, let's say, to share stories to the family as a whole, and then you can kind of process the stories together of their parents or their own experiences, right? Because a lot of times people hear stories kind of, but they don't. It's usually passed from one person to another, and not really from the direct individual, right? As well as it's not shared as a group. So I recommend, if possible, I mean, that's what I would do, is have a family discussion. Everything with the family should be done with the family, in my opinion, not one-on-one, one-on-one, one-on-one. Have it full communication and allow dialogue amongst individuals. Because again, some families, right, have it where the father or mother might be the only one that has an opinion, right, or is allowed to have an opinion in that sense, and the kids just have to listen and take it, right. And I recommend, if you have kids, let them have questions. Answer. Don't shame them for having questions, right? Sometimes kids have questions about their ancestors, right? That they're told, oh, you shouldn't ask that, or don't talk about that, and all that does is kind of double down that kind of hush hush mentality, right? Or the elephant in the room for certain situations, right? Obviously, depending on the topic, you can limit certain things, right? But I think open communication as a family unit, though, is for
Hmm.
any family, any kind of culture. I think it's a very important thing to do. Um, if there's a disagreement in the family, or let's say there's a like in family therapy, for example, I don't specialize in that per se, but I've taken courses obviously in it. And one view is the family's well-being. What happens sometimes, they have a scapegoat. So one kid's the issue. So, oh, they're failing all the classes, they're doing this, they're doing that, right? Then you lose them.
No, I can hear
But
you.
oh no, I thought you lost your kid there. But so what happens is we tend to use a scapegoat in families sometimes, right? Oh, Anthony's messing up in school, Anthony's a troublemaker, Anthony's doing this and that. But the reality is that one individual usually is a product of the family structure itself, if that makes sense. So if one person's doing bad, it could just be because mom and dad are having arguments a lot. Maybe financial issues are going on. Maybe the older siblings are having issues, and the younger kid kind of takes the burden of it as a scapegoat from the family. It starts acting out what's going on. So that's why I always really, really recommend having family discussions. That's regardless of even this topic. I think family discussions can solve a lot of things when it comes to mental health issues, when it comes to just social issues going on with individuals, spiritual issues. I think having open communication amongst family members. Now, not everyone has that luxury in their family, also, just to acknowledge that as well. So that's one thing. Yeah.
Before you continue, I want to acknowledge there
Yeah.
was a comment in the chat that was left by a fellow psychologist, Natalie Kazarian, who works in family therapy, I believe,
Yeah.
though I don't want to misquote her background. And she says, if a lot of resistance comes up, there may be a greater level of intergenerational trauma. And that kind of leads me to a thought I was having as you were speaking, and I absolutely agree with you that greater dialogue within families is always of importance. Strong families, healthy families are the cornerstone of our communities, of our parishes, and certainly, they lead to healthier lives and lifestyles. But the reality of it is that I think, as Natalie's trying to refer to here, often the things we need to talk about are the things that are hardest to talk about.
Absolutely.
It
Yeah.
is very difficult to touch on those really crucial areas of our family's histories, whether they be somewhat contemporary, meaning within our lives, or the stories that have come down to us from our ancestors that we've been taught are too shameful to talk about, and breaking through those barriers in order to have those conversations that can bring about the healing process is a challenge for all
Yeah.
of us. Can you speak to that a little bit?
Well, I think you're kind of loosely referring to the stigma also, right?
Yeah.
And the word stigma, which I didn't know this until I was writing my dissertation. My chair actually taught me. It comes from the word stigmata. Yeah, exactly. To be marked. I didn't even realize that until a couple of years ago. That's what it was, and it's true though. So when someone has stigma, it means that they're being marked by their peers, by society, and by themselves. The worst kind of stigma for my dissertation found out was not actual experienced stigma; it was self-perceived stigma. So the biggest fear of if I tell people about my issue, they're going to treat me like X, Y, Z. That fear of actually talking about a topic was significantly greater than the actual stigma received to them from other individuals. And that was kind of a surprise for me in that sense. So it's an active stigma versus perceived stigma. So that's one thing is that, I have stigma, you have stigma, everyone has stigma. It's impossible not to have stigma. Some people say, oh, I'm no stigma on any topic. The reality is it's just a human experience, right? It might be something small or big in that sense. But talking about it, a lot of times it's kind of a stigma you have within yourself more so than the reaction you get from other individuals. So if this is answering the question you're asking, so it's one of those things of kind of overcoming your own personal kind of stigma is more important than the stigma, than the reaction you get from your family, let's say, or peers in this. So start with someone that you trust. I mean, if you have someone you have absolute trust in and comfort talking to, maybe kind of talk to them first and run it by them and see how it feels getting it off your chest. Because a lot of times it's that idea of getting something off your chest is so painful to do that's the biggest barrier. It's not so much how is their miserable going to respond if I tell them this. That's what I tell myself, let's say. But the reality is, how am I going to respond if I tell him this? If that makes sense. Just my own fear of how I'm going to respond from opening up is greater than my fear of how you're going to respond to me opening up. But it's hard for a lot of people to really kind of comprehend that, and that's the shame, right? The shame people have in that sense.
This is reminiscent, I feel like, of the conversation that we had on that podcast that we recorded so many years ago, which is acknowledging that all of these things are very hard, right? I mean, when you're suffering in your mental health and you need to find help, and when you're dealing with things like depression and anxiety, and here now we're talking about, openly discussing traumatic events in your family's history that maybe until now have been considered too sensitive to discuss collectively in our families. And when we're talking about these things, it's all very scary, right? And we're opening up doors and that we don't know what the consequences of them will be. And one thing that I stressed then, and one thing I absolutely want to stress now is, in this area, our faith plays a profoundly important role by giving us a bedrock upon which, we can find the courage that we need to move forward in areas where we feel alone and isolated and unsupported, whether it be through the support that we find in our church communities, through trusted individuals that we might find, just as you referred to earlier, that can be an ear to hear us and for us to share our woes and concerns. The parish priest, who should always be open to hearing about concerns that you have, and under right circumstances may be in a position to help facilitate those dialogues if it's truly necessary to help break through the ice. And ultimately, and most importantly, through the presence of, a merciful and loving Savior, Jesus Christ, with whom in prayer and in worship we can have a rich relationship with, and can help comfort us when we may fail or be disappointed, and can help us be bold, when we need to be, to do the right thing despite the fact that it's hard. Being a parish priest, I've certainly had at least a few notable opportunities where I've been part of difficult conversations with families that have crossed the span of generations, so that we can start to move beyond the effects of that trauma, if you will. I think it is so important. I'm glad you're taking the conversation in that direction at this point. Just earlier today, I conducted a funeral for a member of our community, a wonderful woman who was blessed with a long life, but nevertheless her loss will be mourned. And as we interred her into her tomb, And, I was with the family and the loved ones as they were feeling their grief and, and mourning sorrowfully, despite the fact that, yes, she was a woman that was blessed with a long life and, loving family. How important it is to be able to feel that pain together,
Yeah.
Collectively, that until we allow ourselves to realize we're not alone in our grief, or in our fear, or in our trauma, for that matter, it's hard to move past it. And sometimes we don't, right? I've seen people who are afraid to mourn, and I understand that, so they're not able to do it openly. They're not able to do it completely. Let me put it like that. Everybody mourns differently, but there is a way to do it fully, and there's a way where it can be stunted
and delayed.
And delayed. I don't say that with any judgment, but just to say that there is an impact, that a person has to bear under those circumstances. And so I guess I'm hearing you say this is also an area where it's simply, bringing things into light and being able to discuss them without shame and judgment, and be able to feel together how it feels is an important part of the process.
Exactly. And I think it's important to say, for the topic of mourning or therapy or talking about these topics in general, regardless of the topic we're talking about, everyone has their own pace. Everyone has their own pace. So, for example, when I mourn, I delay my mourning pretty long, actually. And then it hits me out of nowhere, then I process it. It's just a thing that happens to me in that sense, right? Some people can mourn immediately after a situation, which is, both have their benefits, right, for the individual in that sense, right? So I think it's one of those things that some people might have more of a comfort zone of talking about things more than someone else. So just because you feel comfortable talking about a topic doesn't mean that other individual might be on the same pace that you're at. Doesn't mean that they're not open to talking about it as well. But a lot of times people think, oh, well, I'm trying to address this issue and they don't want to address this issue, therefore they're just avoiding the issue. But the reality is some people have a different pace of how they go about topics, right? Doesn't mean that they're fully cut out of it. It's just that they might need their own kind of personal time to kind of get through a moment, or to build up the kind of energy more so to address a topic in that sense. So just
you're completely right. It can't be forced. But I think creating a loving and supportive environment gives people the opportunity to go through those, to take those steps if they're feeling, hesitant to do so. I've been through that myself in the mourning process, feeling as though I didn't have what it took to accept it, to go through it. Let me put it like that, until much later. And having felt at the other end of it much later, a sense of relief and a comfort that I wished I could have experienced sooner. But that just wasn't the way that went. But go ahead.
Oh, I just want to say, environment plays a huge role, I think, for certain people. For me, it does, for how I cope with situations going on, or how I process situations going on. So, for example, faith for me, I've had my ebbs and flows with my connection with God in that sense. And right now, I would say it's probably one of the strongest it's been in a long time, right? And it's because just something happens in your life, or something clicks in your life, and you really understand kind of the value of faith. And it's really been kind of one of the best protective factors I've had the past several years in that sense. And it's one of those situations where it just comes, when it comes, right? And I don't overthink it. I just enjoy the experience. So when I go to church, for example, I've never been in a church and I don't feel just a different feeling inside me of kind of a comforting kind of feeling in that sense, right? So for example, when you go to church, especially Armenian church, afterwards, we have the coffee and we kind of the social aspect of it. And that could be, for example, someone that might be more isolated, or not connecting very well with people, like through depression and other things. Just being at church is a community event, and it's a community prayer turns into community socialization after, which is very healthy for certain individuals. That might be their only social event of the week, or so on and so on. So your environment you put yourself in, really, like your physical environment, really impacts your growth or your just processing of events of your life. Or like, last thing I'll say is, when I have a tough day at work, the last thing I want to do is just stay home and do nothing. I need to go to the gym, which is at the gym. Do I work out there? Kind of. I more so socialize with friends over there, but that is my ability to kind of process my energy that I have built up inside me. So when you have an environment you know you can use as a healthy coping uh, tool, that's a very important thing. So the church is definitely one of those environments, I would say, for individuals.
Um, yeah, thank you, and I'm so thankful to God that your faith is strong right now. And I
Mm-hmm.
have to imagine, not I know this is a personal topic, we won't veer into it,
Yeah.
but you're you're serving humanity in very difficult circumstances in the
Mm-hmm.
extremes of the human condition, and I have to imagine there are
Mm-hmm.
times when you have to
Yeah.
look to your faith to find hope and
Well, there's a
to
blessing
feel
in that too. I'll
recharged.
just to throw that in there. At my new job, the chaplain is right next to my office, which is absolutely amazing. Having a chaplain there I can talk to, and just about anything. We talk about just life in general usually, but then throughout conversation we throw in psychology stuff, we throw in spirituality topics of God and Christianity, and it's kind of a fun little just dialogue that comes organically. Like when I talk to you, it's very organic how we talk, and I think just that for me has really, for my own personal growth at least, it really helped also in that sense of understanding there's more than just uh, in life than just misery, I guess. That's what I see at work mostly is that sense, right?
Yeah,
There's beauty in everything in that sense.
yeah.
So yeah.
You know, as a parent,
Mm-hmm.
one thought that comes into my mind, and as I'm working with other families, either in premarital preparation or
Mm-hmm.
helping fellow parents, deal with the challenges that come along with modern parenting, this is a topic that has come up in the past, and it's something that I myself has reflected on. And that's, intergenerational trauma is something obviously that, I don't want to say hidden way, but an apocryphal, in a way that isn't visible
Yeah.
to us, in an invisible way comes into our lives and,
Mm-hmm.
to some degree shapes our outlook and our behaviors, if I'm not misunderstanding what you're saying, um, in a way that I would not want to share with my children, if possible.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I know that we
Mm-hmm.
can't protect our children from, all of the, the catastrophes of life that come up, and that's one of the realities of being a parent, which is to acknowledge they live in this fallen world along with us, and we can't shield them from every difficulty, but we could give them the tools they need to be able to cope in a healthy way with their strong faith and a strong sense of identity, understanding that they're loved and they belong in their community and in their family. But as a parent, what do you think I can do? What do you think we can do as parents to cultivate
Yeah.
self-awareness and prevent the transmission of these, perspectives and behaviors onto
Yeah.
future generations?
So to point out, I'm not a parent myself, just to people to understand that also. But my view of this would be the language you use is very important, right? So, for example, in our culture, we use the word odar all the time, right? Which literally translates to outsider or other in that sense. And we view people they're not Armenian, oh, they're an odar, they're this and that, right? Which we use kind of a playful kind of aspect sometimes, but that really, if child's comprehending it, they're like, oh, they're not like me, they're different in that sense, right? Uh, Views of people of communities that have hurt our communities, right? Uh, it's not uncommon for Armenians to openly kind of share our views of other communities that have hurt Armenians in that sense, right? And that's a response to our literal trauma that's happened to us. But the reality is we pass down those views to our kids as well, right? So the way we communicate with our children about topics without shielding them from the topics, but also the way we describe the world pretty much around us is a really important way to do it because our vocabulary really I think is a very important aspect of that as well. And that's kind of a simplified kind of response, but I think that's a really important response to get across also is to start the literal words we use to describe the world around us. The kids soak it all in. And that's how they
Hmm.
start navigating the world without comprehending really what they're saying, what they're all that type of stuff.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. We, as parents, do have to be very careful how we communicate with our kids,
Mm-hmm.
not censoring ourselves necessarily, but being careful what we are communicating without realizing that we're communicating it.
Yeah.
And I'll share with you a an example of this.
Mhm.
As you know, last year there was a tragic earthquake in Turkey. It took thousands
Yeah.
and thousands of lives, and it
Yeah.
was a tragedy. And I won't give any context because I don't want to implicate anybody. But somebody that I know was walking past a child and heard this child say, something to the effect of, they were glad that it happened to the Turks.
Yeah.
It was a young child, who
Yeah,
was,
exactly.
less than 10 maybe.
Yeah.
And as adults, rationally, I think we can immediately understand that that's horrifying. We would never want our children to celebrate the loss of innocent life. That's not who we are as Armenians. Those aren't our values. It's not consistent with our Christian faith. On the other hand, when we imagine that these children have, consistently heard rhetoric that would make them believe, perhaps, that Turkish people's lives would maybe have less value than the lives of others because of what they've done to us, then we can understand how that child would jump to that conclusion in their mind. And we as adults are responsible for communicating to them the fullness of our values and understanding that we can demand justice and, not retribution, but restitution. And still fight in a way that honors our ancestors without involving hatred or devaluing the lives of others. I think that this is, something that we all have to be very careful for in our lives.
I think that's a perfect example.
Members.
Yeah, that's exactly that example kind of sums it up right there. I think also in that sense of that hatred towards the Turkish people, especially for that kid to comprehend, that makes no sense, and that because that kid has not probably interacted with any ever in their life, right? Our ancestors, the situation with them, obviously, right? And, to some degree, what's happened from Turkey as a country to Armenia right now in Artsakh. But that kid probably does not understand what's going on, really, right? As a young child like that.
There's a subtlety that they were not able to understand yet, but we have to be reinforcing that at every level of our, spiritual and national formation. Of course, we don't want to veer into political issues, but it's no political issue to say, as Armenians and certainly as Christians, we have to value all human life. It is probably part of a healing process for us to engage in as communities and families, to uphold that.
And that's saying an eye for an eye,
despite whatever difficulties we experience.
And you've heard that saying, right? That an eye for an eye, the whole world goes blind, and that kind of concept, in a sense, right? If we just keep on swapping traumas to communities that have hurt us, kind of in that sense, just in general terms, it just only passes down more drama to our next generation. Which, so that's important to keep in mind. Just
here again, like from a moral perspective, and in terms of our Christian mission, it's very important for us to reinforce the teachings of the gospel. And have that be the lens through which we view the world, and one that absolutely informs, that justice has to be upheld, right? And we don't give forgiveness easily, but forgiveness is accessible for those who seek it, and that we're all God's children. This is all really crucial, and I think the church plays a really crucial role again in terms of helping to build and maintain a moral compass and a sense of meaningful identity in the life of our communities and in our families, of course. That's why I feel like the greatest aid for parents is a healthy relationship with Christ through the church as part of a community that helps build their cultural identity, their national identity, and their spiritual identity in a balanced way. I've been reflecting recently on this passage. There's that old saying that for a person that has a hammer, every problem is a nail. And for the last couple of weeks, my hammer has been a passage from the Gospel of John, chapter 9, where a blind man is healed by Jesus Christ. And the disciples come to him and they say, by whose sin was he made blind? By the sin of his parents or by his own sin? And Jesus's response, which I found to be like, recently, it's been giving me goosebumps. I don't know why. It's like I'm at a place in my life right now where it's really hitting me. And Jesus' response was like, by the sin of no man is he this way, but so that he should be glorified, so that God should be glorified through him. Meaning he was healed, right? We're not focusing on the pain of the past. Yep. We're not focusing on, the transgressions that have occurred, whether in the generations before him or in his own life, but he came sick and he was healed. And so there was glory there that could be experienced. And it was this really powerful, let's focus just on our own health. Let's focus on, trying to get better. And when we get better, then, we glorify, our community, our families, ourselves, and of course, in the end, God, the Creator. And I've been so encouraged by that, and I've been thinking about that a lot in the context of this.
That's actually a very beautiful passage.
Yeah. Well, I think that we're getting to the point that we're going to wrap up pretty soon. I'm going to, if there's any other comments that come in on the chat and YouTube, if you are watching us via the stream on our website or in the app, you can comment in the chat section on YouTube. I know there were a few different ways to join the live stream tonight. And if you're not able to comment this evening on the live stream, feel free to comment later on as we distribute the recording of tonight's presentation, or reach out to us here at St. John at pastor@stjohnarmenianchurch.com. And we look forward to future presentations related to this series about healing in the church. Next month, we'll be discussing physical healing in different forms that we can experience. But I find like this particular topic is a really interesting entryway to talk about healing. Like, in our church, in the Orthodox Church, really like the spiritual journey is the journey of healing. They're one and the same. Yeah. Theosis, the process of growing closer to God and trying to become more like Jesus Christ, it is the metric for that in many ways is healing. And I think this is a very important venue for that to take place, meaning to talk about this relationship between ourselves and previous generations and how we're part of this ongoing conversation of what has happened to us and how it's affected us.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Well, we're going to wrap up pretty soon. Any parting thoughts before we conclude? And I'll be concluding this evening's discussion with the prayer.
I'm not frozen right now, am I?
Nope, I can see you just fine.
All right, something popped on my screen. So, yeah, just exactly what you said. It's this topic of mental health, right, has a lot of stigma to it just because of how it's been used as a tool against people with mental health issues, right? Like one thing is people say if you are having let's say if you're in an argument with someone, you say, oh, you need to go to therapy, something's wrong with you, this and that, right? So that topic has a stigma because of the way people sometimes weaponize it, right? But the reality is it's a topic that really is neither good nor bad, right? It's just a thing that we all experience. So the topic of generational passing down of trauma is a negative, but also it could be resilience you can pass down, right? So I think this is a very important topic that every single person can relate to. It's just the way you kind of choose to relate to it as, if that makes any sense. It's the lens you look through. For this topic.
I think that's a very wise point to make. It is very easy for us to say, oh my gosh, I feel like for this and that reason, these things, this negativity has come into my life perhaps, from generations that came before me. But one way for us to heal is to uphold and celebrate the wonderful things that have been brought down to us from our ancestors. Expressing gratitude for that, upholding it, placing priority on that above, perhaps this concept of trauma is one way for us to find peace, at least in this conversation. and in this relationship that we have with those that came before us. And I'm acknowledging some of the comments in the chat that we've seen, thanking us for having this discussion today. I think it's important to continue this conversation as much as possible. As I mentioned before, if anybody in my community or from outside of my community has any questions or would like to talk to somebody about this, they can feel free to reach out to me. Dr. Saroyan, do you have any suggestions as to what next steps somebody may take if they want to research this question further?
Yeah, I think just talking to someone you trust, someone like you, dear Mesro, someone that you trust as a professional, let's say, could be a route to do that. Could be from a therapist himself, or it could be from a spiritual leader, or even an elder in your community as well. Someone that you trust, I think, might be a good opportunity to do it, just to kind of get your feet wet with it, in that sense.
Yeah. Thank you so much. Well, we're going to conclude this evening with a prayer, and I've selected a prayer here which I felt as though I was moved to offer on this occasion. This is a prayer of Saint Ephraim, the Syrian, Supia Premasori. In the name of the Father, and the Son, and the Holy Spirit. O Lord, Master of my life, grant that I may not be infected with the spirit of slothfulness and unhelpful inquisitiveness, with the spirit of ambition and vain talking. Grant instead to me, your servant, the spirit of purity and humility, and the spirit of patience and of neighborly love. O Lord and King, grant me the grace of being aware of my sins and of not thinking evil of my brothers and sisters, for you are blessed now and forever. Amen. Blessed be our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ. Amen. Հայր մեր, որ հերգինս ես Սուրբ Եղեցի անուն քո, եկես է արքայություն քո, եղեցին գամ քո, որպես հերգինս եւ երկրի, ըսած մեր հանապազոր, դուր մեզ այսօր եւ թող մեզ զբարդիս մեր, որպես եւ մեկ թողունք մերոց սպարտաբանած, եւ մի դանիրս մեզի փորձություն, այլ փրկյազ մեզի չարե, զիքոյ արքայություն եւ զորություն եւ փառք, հավիտյանս, հավիտենից, amen. May we be blessed by the Holy Spirit and depart this evening in peace, and may the Lord be with us always. Amen. Thank you for the time that you've shared with us tonight, Dr. Saroyan, and God bless you.
I appreciate it. You too. Bye.
Okay. Good night, everyone.